The observation wing alarms activated at exactly 2:07 a.m. Every containment light inside the facility shifted from white to deep pulsing amber. At the same time, steel security doors slammed shut throughout sublevel D hard enough to shake dust from the ceiling vents above me. I remember standing alone inside monitoring room 3, staring at the camera feeds as static swallowed half the observation screens one by one. Outside the reinforced glass, the containment corridor stretched in silence beneath flickering fluorescent lights while heavy rain hammered the facility's roof somewhere far above the underground labs. Then the intercom crackled softly beside the console. "Ethan," a woman whispered through heavy static. "Do not let Subject 12 mimic your voice again." My stomach tightened instantly because I recognized the voice immediately. Dr. Mira Vance, lead behavioral researcher, missing from the observation wing for almost 4 years. Before I could answer, one of the containment cameras flickered back online. Cell 12. At first, the observation room looked empty beneath the red emergency lights. Stainless steel walls. Reinforced glass. Monitoring restraints hanging untouched beside the concrete floor drain. Then the camera slowly adjusted focus toward the dark corner of the cell. Someone was sitting motionless against the wall beneath the shadows. The white facility uniform was soaked with blood and chemical stains. Thin fingers twitching softly against the floor. Then it raised its head toward the camera, and used my voice to say, "He finally recognizes himself." 3 nights earlier, I took the Blackthorne Biomedical contract because I needed money badly enough to ignore how secretive the place sounded over the phone. "My name is Ethan Cross, 33 years old. Former veterinary technician turned emergency animal care specialist after years bouncing between research clinics, wildlife rehabilitation centers, and pharmaceutical testing labs across the Midwest. About 8 months before Blackthorne hired me, my younger brother overdosed alone inside a motel outside Tulsa while I ignored 6 missed calls from him during a night shift at another clinic. After that, everything in my life started collapsing quietly. My relationship ended. I lost my apartment. Sleep became difficult in ways medication never fully fixed. So when a recruiter offered me a temporary overnight position at an isolated private research facility deep in northern Montana with double hazard pay and no required public disclosure agreements, I accepted almost immediately without asking enough questions. At the time, isolation sounded easier than grief. Blackthorne Biomedical sat hidden beyond several miles of forest roads, buried in the mountains near the Canadian border. The facility itself looked less like a laboratory and more like a military installation disguised as medical infrastructure. Tall perimeter fencing surrounded multiple concrete research buildings connected through underground corridors beneath floodlights and armed checkpoints. Most of the surface structures remained windowless except for the administration wing and veterinary intake bay near the eastern security gate. Heavy snowfall covered the surrounding forests during my arrival, muffling almost every sound outside the generators humming constantly beneath the facility grounds. The deeper levels especially carried a strange atmosphere, difficult to explain properly. Everything underground smelled faintly sterile and metallic at the same time, disinfectant layered over something older hiding beneath the ventilation systems and chemical air filters. My supervisor during orientation was Dr. Lena Mercer. Mid-40s, maybe. Thin, exhausted-looking, with the kind of controlled professional tone people develop after spending too long around situations requiring emotional distance. She walked me through the standard responsibilities first. Overnight animal observation. Sedation monitoring. Emergency response protocols if containment systems fail during behavioral testing cycles. Most of the job involved supervising the lower observation wing between midnight and sunrise while the main research staff remained off-duty upstairs. According to Mercer, Blackthorne specialized in neurological behavioral adaptation studies involving advanced cognitive pattern recognition in test subjects. I understood enough scientific terminology to follow the broad explanations without fully understanding what they were actually experimenting on beneath the facility. Then, near the end of orientation, Mercer handed me a separate binder labeled Observation Wing Night Protocols. The instructions inside felt less like medical procedures and more like survival rules written by someone increasingly paranoid over time. Never respond verbally if a subject uses your name after midnight. Avoid direct eye contact with Subject 12 during active observation cycles. If the containment wing speakers repeat your voice, leave monitoring room 3 immediately. Do not enter empty observation cells during electrical storms. If a subject appears sedated despite monitoring systems reading active consciousness, trust the monitors instead of visual confirmation. And the final rule, printed larger than the others across the last page. If you begin hearing conversations before subjects physically speak, report to medical evaluation before continuing your shift. I remember asking Mercer directly whether the observation wing dealt with violent animals or psychological patients because none of the instructions sounded remotely connected to ordinary veterinary research. She stared at me for several seconds before glancing toward the underground elevator descending into sublevel D. The subjects adapt unusually well to environmental feedback, she said quietly. Some staff members become emotionally attached to the observation cycles if they spend too much time downstairs. Before ending the orientation, Mercer showed me the emergency containment controls capable of sealing the entire observation wing during behavioral incidents. Then she mentioned Dr. Mira Vance almost casually while reviewing old security procedures. Lead behavioral researcher assigned to Subject 12 during the facility's earlier trial phases. Officially, Vance disappeared during a containment failure 4 years earlier after remaining inside the observation wing during a severe electrical storm. Unofficially, nobody ever recovered a body. Most people working down there too long stopped trusting their own perception eventually, Mercer said while shutting off the monitoring screens for the evening transition. Then the lights inside the underground elevator flickered once. For less than a second, during the brief darkness, I could have sworn someone was standing motionless behind the reinforced observation glass at the far end of sublevel D, watching us from inside Cell 12. The first few nights inside the observation wing almost convinced me the protocols were nothing more than exaggerated safety procedures built around unstable research subjects and exhausted overnight staff. Isolation affects people quickly in underground facilities, especially those operating on reverse schedules where entire shifts pass without natural sunlight or normal human interaction. My routine settled into predictable patterns after orientation. Around 9 p.m., I begin monitoring sedation cycles, behavioral recordings, and biometric readings from the lower observation cells while the daytime researchers finished their final testing rounds upstairs. Most of the subjects remained heavily sedated during overnight hours anyway. According to the files I could access, Blackthorne's experiments focused primarily on behavioral mimicry and adaptive neurological pattern recognition in genetically altered primates. Strange research, but not supernatural. I'd worked enough pharmaceutical contracts to know private biomedical facilities often surrounded sensitive projects with unnecessary secrecy and psychological conditioning to keep lower-level employees compliant. Sublevel D carried a deeply uncomfortable atmosphere after midnight. The observation wing stretched beneath the facility through long, sterile corridors lined with reinforced glass containment cells and isolated monitoring stations humming softly beneath fluorescent lights at all hours. Every sound underground felt amplified somehow. Ventilation systems breathed constantly through hidden ducts behind the walls while distant machinery vibrated faintly beneath the floors around the containment chambers. Some nights, the wing almost sounded conversational if you listened too long. Most of the observation cells remained dark and inactive during overnight rotations except for Cell 12 at the far end of the corridor. That room always stayed illuminated regardless of the hour. According to the security logs, Subject 12 required continuous behavioral monitoring because sedation cycles supposedly destabilized its neurological responses unpredictably. Nobody ever explained exactly what Subject 12 actually was. The first strange incident happened during my fourth night while a winter storm moved across the mountains above the facility. Around 12:37 a.m., one of the observation monitors inside Monitoring Room 3 briefly displayed movement inside Cell 12 despite the subject's biometric readings showing complete sedation. At first, I assumed the camera feed was lagging because of the storm interference affecting the underground systems. But the figure inside the cell kept moving slowly across the monitor while every medical indicator continued reading inactive consciousness. The subject stood motionless near the reinforced glass, staring at the observation camera directly beneath the pale fluorescent lighting. Human-shaped, thin, wearing standard white containment clothing, stained dark around the sleeves and collar. Then the overhead speaker beside the monitor crackled softly through static. "Night observation stable," a woman whispered calmly. "Do not acknowledge verbal mimicry." Before I could respond, the transmission cut off completely. I reviewed the system diagnostics afterward, mostly to reassure myself. Camera desynchronization happens constantly in underground facilities during electrical storms. Sedation monitors malfunction. Audio interference bleeds through internal communication systems. Still explainable. Still manageable. But smaller things started accumulating after that night. Sometimes I'd hear movement inside empty observation rooms despite the biometric systems showing no active subjects nearby. Twice, I found Monitoring Room 3 already unlocked during overnight rotation, even though access logs showed nobody entering beforehand. One morning, the containment alarms activated briefly at exactly 2:07 a.m. before shutting themselves off again without any recorded breach inside the observation wing. The worst part wasn't the incidents themselves. It was how normal the senior staff acted whenever I mentioned them upstairs. Like, strange behavior underground was simply an accepted side effect of working near Subject 12 long enough. On my sixth night, I accidentally broke the first rule without realizing it. Heavy snowstorms rolled across the mountains shortly after midnight, causing intermittent electrical fluctuations throughout sublevel D. Around 1:03 a.m., Cell 12's monitoring systems briefly lost connection with the sedation controls, requiring manual verification from the lower observation corridor outside the containment chamber. Normally, the procedure took less than 5 minutes. I grabbed the access tablet and headed downstairs without thinking too much about the protocols. The deeper I moved into the observation wing, the quieter the facility became. Motion-sensitive lights activated slowly ahead of me while the ventilation systems hummed softly through the sterile underground corridors surrounding the containment wing. Halfway toward Cell 12, the overhead speaker crackled suddenly through static. "Ethan," Dr. Mira Vance whispered. "You shouldn't answer it if it uses your brother's voice." Every muscle in my body locked instantly because I had never mentioned my brother to anyone at Blackthorne. Then the corridor lights flickered once. And for a brief second, reflected in the reinforced glass outside Cell 12, I saw someone walking directly behind me wearing my face. The reflection disappeared almost immediately when the corridor lights stabilized again. 1 second, another version of me followed silently a few feet behind the reinforced observation glass beside Cell 12. The next, the hallway stood empty except for fluorescent lights humming softly above the polished floor around me. I remember freezing in place while cold pressure settled slowly behind my ribs, hard enough to make breathing uncomfortable. Rationally, I understood what probably happened. Reflections distort strangely across reinforced glass under intermittent lighting conditions. Underground isolation affects depth perception after enough hours awake. Still explainable. Still manageable. But Dr. Mira Vance's voice over the speaker bothered me far more than the reflection itself, because the transmission hadn't sounded distorted beneath the static. It sounded immediate. Like someone speaking quietly through a nearby intercom instead of a disconnected facility system tied to a researcher declared missing 4 years earlier. I should have returned to monitoring room 3 immediately after that. Instead, embarrassment pushed me farther down the corridor towards cell 12. I'd spent years working in emergency veterinary care and biomedical observation contracts. The idea that I was becoming unsettled by strange reflections and psychological protocols during a snowstorm felt ridiculous, even while every instinct kept telling me to leave the observation wing immediately. The biometric issue itself turned out to be minor. Sedation monitors near cell 12 displayed fluctuating neurological readings because of electrical interference affecting the underground systems during the storm. The subject remained seated motionless against the far wall beneath the dim containment lights while I ran diagnostics through the observation tablet outside the glass. Human-shaped. Thin. Head lowered slightly against its chest. For several minutes, everything felt normal again. Mechanical. Explainable. Then I noticed something strange on the observation monitor mounted beside the containment door. The subject's audio feed was active before it physically spoke. At first, I thought the headphones were malfunctioning. Then I heard my own breathing through the speakers roughly 2 seconds before I actually inhaled. Every muscle in my body locked instantly while the sound continued repeating softly through the monitoring system beside the cell. Not pre-recorded audio. Real-time anticipation. The containment monitor played my movements moments before they physically happened. Breathing. Shifting posture. Even the nervous click of my thumb against the access tablet before I consciously made the motion myself. Then the subject inside cell 12 slowly raised its head toward the reinforced glass. The face looked disturbingly ordinary beneath the pale fluorescent lighting. Male maybe. Mid-30s. Hollow-eyed and exhausted in the specific way long-term hospital patients sometimes appear after months underground without natural sunlight. But the expression felt subtly wrong somehow. Too aware. Like it had been studying me long before I arrived at Blackthorne. Then it smiled slightly and used my voice perfectly through the containment speaker. You already know what happens before you do it. I broke the rule right there without thinking. What are you? I asked aloud. The moment the words left my mouth, every light inside the observation wing flickered violently overhead. Not random electrical instability. Reaction. The containment glass surrounding cell 12 vibrated softly while the biometric monitors surged into warning status beside the door. Inside the cell, the subject remained seated motionless against the wall. But its reflection in the reinforced glass moved independently from the body behind it. The reflection stood up first. Slowly. Calmly. Then approached the glass several seconds before the actual subject physically moved at all. My stomach dropped instantly because I realized the thing inside the reflection was already closer to me than the body sitting inside the cell. Then the overhead speakers crackled softly through waves of static. "Ethan," my brother whispered, why using the exact exhausted tone from his final voicemail before dying alone in Oklahoma. "Please don't leave me here again." I left the observation wing immediately after hearing my brother's voice through the containment speakers, but the damage had already happened by then. Something inside cell 12 changed the moment I answered it aloud. At first, the effects felt subtle enough to rationalize individually. The monitoring systems across sublevel D became increasingly inconsistent during storms. Audio feeds were activated before subjects physically spoke. Security cameras displayed movement several seconds ahead of real-time activity inside the observation cells. Some nights, the biometric monitors showed elevated emotional stress responses in sedated subjects before any visible disturbance occurred in the rooms themselves. But the deeper problem wasn't technological anymore. The observation wing itself started feeling predictive in ways difficult to explain properly. Conversations repeated inside my head moments before staff members actually said the words aloud. Elevator doors opened before I pressed the call buttons. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps approaching behind me through the corridors several seconds before anyone physically appeared. The intercom systems became more active almost immediately after the incident in Cell 12. Some nights, disconnected speakers replayed fragments of conversations from earlier shifts using staff voices slightly out of sequence with the original dialogue. Other times, the transmissions became deeply personal. My ex-girlfriend asked why I emotionally disappeared after my brother died. My father calmly repeated childhood arguments I hadn't thought about in years. Once, I heard my own voice describing a maintenance route through the observation wing roughly 30 seconds before I physically walked it myself. The worst part wasn't the accuracy. It was the timing. Every transmission arrived before the associated memory or action occurred naturally. Like the facility already understood what emotional response I would have before I experienced it consciously myself. Then the reflections started changing. At first, it only happened inside reinforced glass near Cell 12. Reflections lag behind movement slightly, or maintaining eye contact a second too long after I turn away. But within days, the phenomenon spread throughout sublevel D entirely. Monitoring screens. Stainless steel surfaces. Dark computer displays after shutdown. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of myself standing differently in reflections than I physically was in the room. Other night, the mirrored versions of staff members continued moving briefly after the real people stopped. The worst incidents happened during severe storms when electrical interference affected the underground systems most aggressively. That's when the reflections inside the observation wing began anticipating movement several seconds ahead instead of merely copying it afterward. Like the facility itself, no longer distinguished clearly between prediction and observation. The senior researchers acted strangely calm about all of it. Not dismissive. Prepared. During one overnight shift, I confronted Dr. Mercer directly after watching a security monitor display my reflection entering monitoring room 3 nearly 10 seconds before I physically arrived there. She listened silently while reviewing containment reports upstairs in the administration wing, then closed the folder in front of her without looking surprised at all. Subject 12 responds strongly to unresolved emotional recognition, she said quietly. Most employees assigned to the observation wing eventually experience anticipatory synchronization after prolonged exposure. The sentence meant absolutely nothing scientifically, and she knew it. Before I could press further, the lights inside her office flickered softly from another storm rolling across the mountains overhead. Mercer stared toward the darkened window beside the research desk for several seconds before speaking again. The important thing is never believing the reflections are reacting to you, she whispered. They're reacting to the version of you they already learned. That night, the containment alarms activated again at exactly 2:07 a.m. Continuous this time. Deep mechanical sirens echoed through the underground corridors while every observation monitor inside monitoring room 3 shifted automatically to Cell 12. The room appeared empty at first beneath the red emergency lighting. Reinforced restraints hanging untouched beside the concrete floor drain. Stainless steel walls streaked faintly with old chemical stains. Then the camera angle was slowly adjusted toward the observation glass. Someone stood on the opposite side of the reflection instead of inside the cell itself. Same uniform I wore. Same posture. Same exhausted expression I'd seen in mirrors every morning since arriving at Blackthorne. My reflection slowly raised one hand against the inside of the glass while I stood frozen in the monitoring room several floors away. Then it spoke through the containment speakers using my voice perfectly. "He remembers us now." After the reflection spoke through the containment speakers, I stopped pretending Blackthorne was conducting ordinary biomedical research. No neurological experiment explains predictive reflections or conversations replaying before they physically happen. Whatever existed inside Cell 12 had nothing to do with animal behavior anymore. The next morning, I started digging through the facility archives more aggressively than before. Most of the deeper project files remained locked behind research clearance levels far above my access authorization, but enough fragments existed inside old veterinary reports and discarded behavioral logs to piece together a rough timeline. Blackthorne Biomedical originally operated as a classified cognitive response laboratory funded through private defense contracts during the late 1990s. Early experiments apparently focused on accelerated pattern recognition in primates exposed to predictive behavioral conditioning. Then, sometime around 2007, the documentation changed completely. References to animal subjects disappeared almost entirely. From that point onward, every sealed file centered around something called the observation synchronization trials. The deeper I searched, the stranger the records became. Internal reports described test subjects developing the ability to anticipate spoken language and physical movement before conscious execution occurred. At first, the phenomenon remained limited to small predictive behaviors: eye movement, speech timing, motor response acceleration. But prolonged exposure produced increasingly severe effects among both subjects and researchers. Conversations repeated before they happened. Reflections moved independently from the originals. Entire observation recordings captured emotional reactions occurring seconds before triggering events physically took place. Then I found the old containment notes connected to Dr. Mira Vance. According to the reports, Vance believed the experiments had accidentally created a neurological feedback environment capable of destabilizing normal human perception of linear time inside the observation wing. One sentence from her final research memo appeared repeatedly throughout the file: "Recognition itself has become anticipatory." Then I discovered what Subject 12 actually was. Not an animal. Not even fully a patient anymore. The original subject had been a volunteer researcher assigned to the synchronization trials nearly 11 years earlier. A cognitive behavioral specialist named Adrian Vale was repeatedly exposed to prolonged predictive observation environments beneath sublevel D. According to the medical records, Vale gradually lost the ability to distinguish between observed behavior and anticipated behavior after months inside the observation wing. He began responding to conversations before people spoke, reacting emotionally to events before they physically occurred. Eventually, the researchers concluded that Vale's perception no longer experienced reality sequentially the same way ordinary consciousness does. Instead, his mind processed recognition patterns slightly ahead of direct experience itself. The horrifying part wasn't the diagnosis. It was the final containment assessment attached to the file. Subject 12 no longer imitates observed identity patterns, it read. The subject predicts them into synchronization. That night, the observation wing changed completely. The storm above the mountains started shortly after midnight. Heavy snow hammered the facility's roof while electrical interference rippled visibly through the fluorescent lighting beneath sublevel D. Around 1:11 a.m., I noticed something impossible on the security monitors. Every camera inside the observation wing displayed movement roughly 3 seconds before it physically occurred in real time. Reflections crossing containment glass before staff entered the frame. The doors opened moments before the handles turned. Then the intercom beside monitoring room 3 crackled softly through static. "Ethan," Mira Vance whispered calmly. "The facility knows you understand the synchronization now." Before I could answer, every monitor shifted automatically to cell 12. The room stood empty beneath the red emergency lights. But reflected in the reinforced glass surrounding the containment chamber, dozens of people moved slowly through the room, despite nobody physically being inside it. Then I saw my brother standing among them. Not a memory. Not distorted. Perfect. Same tired face from the motel security photos after he died. Same jacket he wore during our last argument. He approached the observation glass slowly while the reflections around him continued moving independently through the containment chamber. And standing directly behind him, inside the reflection, was another version of me wearing my facility uniform. Same posture. Same exhaustion. Except his reflection moved slightly ahead of his body, in the same way Subject 12's had before. Then my brother looked directly toward the monitoring camera and spoke softly, using the exact voice from his final unanswered voicemail. "You always arrive after the worst part already happened." Seeing my brother inside the containment reflections changed something fundamental inside me. Up until then, I could still force parts of what was happening at Blackthorne into explanations involving experimental psychology, neurological contamination, or perception disorders caused by prolonged underground isolation. But grief doesn't reconstruct itself perfectly inside reinforced glass using private memories no one else should know. Whatever Subject 12 became beneath the observation wing wasn't simply predicting behavior anymore. It was learning emotional recognition deeply enough to synchronize people against their own unresolved memories. Mira Vance's research suddenly made horrifying sense in ways it hadn't before. The facility didn't create hallucinations exactly. It destabilized the separation between anticipation and experience until emotional recognition itself became predictive. That's why the reflections moved first. Reflections already exist slightly detached from direct reality naturally. The observation wing simply taught them how to synchronize independently from the originals over time. I stopped sleeping properly after that night. Most mornings, I sat alone inside the employee dormitory above ground, staring through snow-covered windows toward the dark research buildings buried beneath the mountain while trying to convince myself to leave Blackthorne immediately. But leaving no longer felt simple. The synchronization effects followed me outside the observation wing now. Reflections in bathroom mirrors reacted half a second early before I physically moved. Conversations repeated softly inside my head moments before coworkers spoke them aloud. Once, I heard my own voice answering a question before Dr. Mercer even finished asking it during a briefing upstairs. According to Myra's final research files, prolonged exposure eventually created residual anticipatory recognition outside the containment environment entirely. Former researchers reportedly experienced predictive synchronization months after leaving the facility. Some lost the ability to determine whether thoughts originated from memory or anticipation. Others disappeared after claiming reflections in ordinary mirrors had stopped matching them completely. So instead of running, I started studying the patterns the same way Mira apparently had before vanishing. The observation wing became more unstable during storms. Emotional reactions strengthened the synchronization effects dramatically. Most importantly, reflections only gained independence after enough prolonged recognition exposure occurred between the subject and the observer. I created my own rules after that. Never look directly into reinforced glass longer than necessary. Never respond emotionally if a reflection uses familiar memories or voices. Never acknowledge predictive conversations aloud. Most importantly, never allow yourself to believe the synchronized versions are emotionally real, regardless of who they resemble. For a while, The system actually seemed calmer afterward. Fewer intercom transmissions. Fewer predictive distortions. Some nights, the observation wing almost felt ordinary again beneath the fluorescent lights and sterile corridors underground. But the facility adapted quickly once I stopped reacting emotionally the way it expected. Instead of reflections, the synchronization started affecting physical movement directly. The first time happened during a routine overnight inspection through sublevel D. I turned a corner near monitoring room 3 and suddenly experienced roughly 3 full seconds of events before they physically occurred around me. Not visions. Certainty. I knew the overhead light would flicker before it happened. Knew a maintenance cart would roll loose from the corridor alcove before it moved. Knew Dr. Mercer would call my name through the intercom before the speaker activated. Every event unfolded exactly the way I had already experienced it internally moments earlier. The sensation felt deeply wrong in ways difficult to describe properly. Not like predicting outcomes logically. More like reality itself briefly repeating after I already lived through it once. Then I passed one of the darkened observation windows near cell 12 and saw my reflection standing completely still inside the glass while I physically continued walking several feet farther down the corridor. 3 nights later, I found Mira Vance's final research journal hidden inside an abandoned storage cabinet beneath monitoring room 3. The writing looked unstable compared to her earlier reports, smeared across the pages like someone documenting thoughts faster than linear perception could organize them properly anymore. Subject 12 was never the source, one sentence read repeatedly throughout the notebook. The observation wing itself became synchronized. Another line appeared hard enough to tear through the paper beneath it. Recognition creates anticipation faster than consciousness can process sequence. According to Myra's final notes, the facility accidentally transformed prolonged emotional observation into a feedback environment where future recognition patterns bled backward into present perception. The deeper someone was emotionally connected to the synchronized reflections, the less distinction remained between anticipated identity and experience afterward. I barely finished reading the last page before the containment alarms activated throughout sublevel D again. Every light inside the observation wing shifted instantly to emergency red. And on the surveillance monitor mounted beside the storage cabinet, cell 12 was already open. The containment sirens echoed through sublevel D hard enough to vibrate the reinforced observation glass around the monitoring stations, while every biometric monitor inside the observation wing surged into warning status simultaneously. Red emergency lighting flooded the underground corridors beneath the facility, transforming the sterile research wing into something far older and more organic than a laboratory. Somewhere above us, thunder rolled directly across the mountain ridge while electrical interference rippled visibly through the fluorescent lights surrounding the containment cells. Then the intercom crackled softly beside monitoring room 3. "Ethan," Mira Vance whispered calmly through static. "The synchronization no longer needs containment barriers." My stomach tightened instantly because her tone didn't sound frightened anymore. It sounded exhausted, like someone explaining a process already too far along to reverse. Then the security cameras inside cell 12 flickered back online. The room was empty. Not temporarily. Wrong. The containment restraints hung untouched beneath the emergency lights while biometric systems continued displaying elevated neurological activity from inside the chamber despite no physical subject appearing anywhere in the room itself. But reflected across the reinforced observation glass surrounding the empty cell, dozens of people stood motionless inside the chamber watching the monitoring cameras. Researchers, security staff, patients. Some wore facility uniforms from different decades. Others looked incomplete somehow, faces subtly distorted like emotional memories reconstructed imperfectly from anticipation rather than reality. And standing closest to the observation glass beneath the emergency lighting was another version of me wearing my overnight badge and facility jacket. Same exhausted posture. Same hollow expression I'd started seeing in mirrors lately whenever I slept badly enough. Except his reflection moved independently several seconds ahead of the body attached to it. Then every speaker inside the observation wing activated simultaneously. Hundreds of voices speak softly through the underground corridors around me. My brother asked why I only cared after losing people permanently. My father is repeating old arguments from childhood. My own voice calmly narrating actions I hadn't physically taken yet.
Beneath all of them, another sound emerged gradually through the static. Footsteps. Dozens of them are moving slowly through the lower observation corridors toward monitoring room 3. Not running, not frantic, deliberate. Then the duplicate inside the containment reflection raised one hand toward the glass. "You still think sequence defines identity," he whispered, using my voice perfectly. "That's why the synchronization frightens you." Behind him, the reflected people inside cell 12 began moving through the chamber before their bodies physically followed several seconds later. Some never followed at all. Their reflections continued walking independently through the room, while no corresponding person existed outside the glass anymore. The observation wing itself started changing after that. Not metaphorically, physically. Corridors extended longer than they should have been beneath the emergency lighting, while observation windows appeared along walls that didn't contain rooms behind them before. Monitoring stations rearranged themselves subtly between glances. Entire sections of sublevel D felt slightly out of sequence with each other, like the facility no longer processed linear time consistently underground during the storm. The deeper I moved into the observation Y, and G trying to reach the emergency containment controls, the more aggressively reality itself seemed to anticipate my actions before I consciously performed them. Doors opened moments before I touched them. Conversations repeated inside my head before the speakers were activated. Reflections crossed polished floors ahead of my footsteps like the facility already understood where I would stand before arriving there physically. Then I reached cell 12. The containment chamber door stood fully open beneath the emergency lights, while cold air drifted slowly through the corridor, despite the underground climate systems remaining stable. Inside the room, Subject 12 sat motionless against the far wall exactly the way I first saw him nights earlier. Thin frame, hollow eyes. White containment clothing was stained dark around the sleeves. But now dozens of synchronized reflections surrounded him independently throughout the chamber. Different versions of the same man sitting, standing, or walking through the room several seconds ahead, or behind the physical body against the wall. Some older, some younger, some wearing faces pulled directly from my own memories instead of his. Then Subject 12 slowly raised his head toward me and smiled faintly. "You still believe anticipation follows experience," he whispered calmly. "But grief works backward, Ethan." Behind him, reflected in the reinforced glass, my brother slowly stepped forward from the synchronized crowd, using my voice to say the sentence I dreaded hearing most. "You only started missing me after you already lost me." For several seconds, I couldn't move. The observation wing around me hummed beneath the emergency lighting, while synchronized reflections drifted independently through the reinforced glass surrounding cell 12. Subject 12 remained seated calmly against the far wall, looking at me with the exhausted expression of someone who had stopped experiencing time normally years earlier. Behind him, dozens of reflected versions of my brother moved silently through the chamber several seconds ahead of physical reality itself. Some smiled faintly, others looked angry, but none of them felt random. Every version represented some emotional possibility my mind already carried long before arriving at Blackthorne. Then Subject 12 spoke again, using my voice softly through the containment room. "The facility only synchronizes unresolved recognition," he whispered. "That's why grief spreads through anticipation faster than ordinary memory." My stomach tightened instantly, because part of me already understood the truth inside the sentence before he finished speaking it aloud. That was the moment I finally understood what Blackthorne actually created. The observation wing wasn't predicting behavior. It was collapsing the emotional distance between anticipation and regret. Every human being mentally rehearses loss before it happens. We imagine conversations ending badly. Imagine people dying. Imagine guilt before a tragedy physically arrives, because consciousness constantly anticipates emotional outcomes subconsciously. The synchronization trials accidentally transformed that natural process into something measurable and contagious underground. Subject 12 didn't gain supernatural predictive abilities. His mind simply stopped separating anticipated emotional recognition from lived experience entirely. And once the observation wing amplified the condition through endless observation feedback cycles, reflections became capable of acting independently, because the facility no longer distinguished between emotional anticipation and physical reality properly anymore. That's why my brother appeared there. Not because the facility resurrected him, because guilt already preserved a synchronized version of him inside me long before I entered Blackthorne.
Then I noticed the emergency neural isolation controls mounted beside the observation chamber wall. According to the warning labels, activating the system would permanently disable the synchronization network beneath sublevel D by overloading the sensory feedback arrays linking the observation rooms together. The process would effectively destroy years of Blackthorne's research overnight. It would also trap anyone currently synchronized inside the observation wing during the neural collapse event. Subject 12 followed my gaze immediately. For the first time since I encountered him, his expression changed slightly. Not fear exactly. Sadness. "If you sever the network," he whispered, "the reflections won't disappear. They'll lose sequence." Around us, the synchronized versions inside the reinforced glass began moving more erratically beneath the emergency lighting. Reflections drifting independently from their physical bodies entirely now. Some lagged minutes behind reality. Others anticipated movements before the associated people consciously decided them at all. The intercom systems throughout sublevel D activated simultaneously again. Hundreds of voices speaking softly through the corridors around the containment wing. My brother apologized for the final voicemail I never answered. My own voice repeated future actions before I performed them. Mira Vance whispering fragmented warnings through static. Beneath all of them, another sound emerged gradually through the observation wing. Conversations occur completely out of sequence with themselves. Questions answered before being asked. Emotional reactions surfaced before the triggering memories appeared. The deeper synchronization spread through the facility, the less stable the linear perception became underground. Reflections crossed the observation glass before people physically entered rooms. Entire conversations replayed backward through the speakers around us. And standing inside the containment chamber watching synchronized versions of my grief drift independently through reinforced glass, I realized something horrifying. The facility wasn't just affecting perception anymore. It was teaching emotional anticipation how to exist without human consciousness attached to it. I activated the neural isolation system anyway. The effect on Blackthorne was immediate. Deep beneath the observation wing, the synchronization arrays overloaded simultaneously hard enough to plunge half the underground facility into darkness instantly. Every reflection inside the reinforced glass surrounding Cell 12 shattered out of sequence across the chamber, while emergency lights burst overhead in waves of sparks and static. The synchronized voices throughout Sublevel D dissolved into overlapping fragments of memory and anticipation, collapsing against each other through the intercom systems. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorne, Subject 12 looked genuinely afraid. Not of dying. Of separation. Like someone realizing they were about to experience time linearly again after years trapped inside emotional synchronization. Then the reflections surrounding us began disappearing one by one throughout the containment chamber. My brother is among them. But just before the final synchronized image vanished completely from the reinforced glass, he looked directly toward me and spoke one last sentence using my own voice. You still think this started after I died? I barely escaped the observation wing before the synchronization collapse consumed most of Sublevel D. The neural isolation overload tore through the underground research systems hard enough to destroy the containment network beneath Blackthorne within minutes. Emergency lights failed section by section behind me while alarms screamed continuously through corridors, no longer processing the sequence consistently. I remember running through hallways where doors opened before I physically reached them and hearing my own footsteps echo several seconds ahead of my movement through the facility. The synchronization effects didn't stop immediately after the overload was activated. They destabilized violently. Reflections across reinforced glass shattered into overlapping versions of people moving out of order beneath clouds of sparks and darkness. Some corridors stretched impossibly long before collapsing back into normal dimensions moments later. Others replayed fragments of earlier events repeatedly, like the observation wing itself was struggling to experience time linearly again after years of predictive feedback underground. Then came the sound from beneath the facility. Not explosions. Something deeper. A low-layered groan vibrating upward through the underground structure like enormous pressure shifting beneath the observation chambers after decades of containment. The synchronization arrays were overloaded completely seconds later. Every speaker inside Blackthorne activated simultaneously one final time while thousands of overlapping voices dissolved into static throughout the facility. Conversations replayed backward. Emotional reactions surfaced before the associated memories. My brother's voice repeated fragments of that final unanswered voicemail through the collapsing observation wing while emergency systems sealed the lower research sectors automatically beneath reinforced blast doors. Then the power died completely. Total darkness swallowed Sublevel D except for the dim emergency strips guiding evacuation routes toward the surface, while the underground containment wing disappeared behind collapsing steel doors beneath the mountain. Officially, Blackthorne Biomedical shut down after a catastrophic systems failure destroyed years of classified neurological research beneath the facility. That explanation satisfied most people because private biomedical contractors collapse under ethics violations and infrastructure accidents constantly. Why once enough money disappears behind them. Nobody questioned why federal oversight teams demolished most of the underground complex afterward. Nobody asked why surviving staff signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements before disappearing into reassignment programs or medical observation. The investigators mostly focused on whether prolonged isolation and stress affected my perception during the containment failure. I let them believe that version because certain truths stop sounding more believable the more accurately you describe them. Still, one detail unsettled even the recovery personnel overseeing the shutdown. During the final diagnostic sweeps beneath Sublevel D, several monitoring systems continued displaying predictive synchronization activity despite the neural arrays being physically destroyed hours earlier. I left Montana 2 weeks later and never worked in biomedical research again. For a while, I convinced myself that destroying the synchronization network would end whatever Blackthorne accidentally created beneath the observation wing permanently. Trauma eventually becomes easier to package into manageable explanations once enough distance exists between you and the place where it happened. But some things refused to fit into rational categories afterward. About 4 months after the shutdown, I received an unmarked package containing only a damaged facility hard drive recovered from monitoring room 3 before the collapse. Against every instinct telling me not to watch it, I connected the drive to my laptop late one night and opened the final surviving observation recording from Cell 12. The footage showed the containment chamber moments before the neural isolation system activated. Subject 12 sat motionless against the far wall beneath the emergency lights while synchronized reflections drifted independently around the reinforced glass. And standing closest to the camera inside the reflections was another version of me wearing my facility uniform. Same posture. Same exhausted expression I'd started seeing in mirrors after leaving Blackthorne. Then, just before the footage ended, the synchronized version of me slowly turned toward the camera and spoke calmly using my voice. You still experience grief in the future tense. I barely sleep now. Most nights, I wake around 2:07 a.m., convinced conversations have already happened before people physically speak to me. Sometimes reflections in dark windows react a moment too early before I move away from them. Other nights, during storms especially, I hear fragments of familiar voices through air vents or disconnected speakers moments before phone calls arrive from people I haven't heard from in years. But the worst moments happen with memory itself. Every once in a while, I'll remember an emotional conversation before it physically occurs later, that way, the same way I already experienced it internally beforehand. And during those moments, I always think about Subject 12 sitting calmly inside the containment chamber beneath Blackthorne while synchronized reflections drifted around him through reinforced glass. Because eventually I realized the most horrifying part of the observation wing wasn't that it predicted behavior. It was that grief had been anticipating us long before we recognized it.